Good morning, good evening from wherever you are. I'm Ramakrishna. I'm the Chief Academic Advisor for Plaksha University. I'm speaking to you from the West Coast in the United States. I'm really delighted to introduce the two speakers who are thought leaders, and their complementary expertise is a perfect blend to discuss what today's topic, a truly cross-disciplinary and a complicated subject. They will enlighten us on some of the tremendous opportunities for technology in the technology domain, but also on how to deploy them wisely and equitably across all sectors of society. So I think those are the two important points that they will cover. Before I highlight some aspects of their very impressive bios, I would, please permit me to say a few words about the topic of today. Precision medicine, I believe, is a paradigm shift in the delivery of healthcare from the standardized, one-size-fits-all kind of model to a more nuanced approach that's now being increasingly enabled by technology, such as digital tools and other technologies, wearable sensors, IoT, AI, artificial intelligence and machine learning, computer vision, and next-gen genomic sequencing, just to name a few. Yes, we are getting nearer and nearer to realizing the goal of personalized medicine, which is basically to deliver the right diagnostics, the right treatment, or the right intervention at the right time to the right patient. So these are some of the lofty goals of precision medicine. However, there are some challenges, not only in the technologies themselves, but also in other dimensions, including policy, regulatory framework, economics, and ethics. So these are some of the topics that will be discussed today. And at this time, I'd like to introduce more formally the two speakers who, if I may call them, friends of Plaksha. We might have to send them a cap or a t-shirt for that. But at this point, I'll just send them, say that friends of Plaksha allowed us to have them here. Dr. Genya V is the head of healthcare at World Economic Forum. She sets the strategic direction for the forum's health and healthcare program broadly, in concert with partners and stakeholders from industry, from academia, from government, and civil society. She has 2 decades of experience in this domain and an internationally known expert in genomics and biotech, and has dabbled for the past 10 years in policy and served as the chief negotiator for U.S. Department of State at the United Nations in multilateral discussions. And for a brief period, she was also the acting deputy science and technology advisor for the Secretary of State in the US. She has a doctorate in bio and environmental risk assessment, a master's degree in public policy from the Humphrey School, and also the PhDs from University of Minnesota. Professor Vijay Chandru received his BTech from BITS Pilani and PhD in the mathematics of decision sciences at MIT, some time ago. And he has spent about a decade in Purdue University as a professor, and then after that, past 20 years at the Indian Institute of Science as well. And he is a true kind of a blend between an academic and an entrepreneur. He has been the executive advisor to the Department of Science and Technology's hub for AI and robotics for healthcare at the Indian Institute of Science. He is also on the commission, the Lancet Commission for Reimagining India's Health, this precision medicine solutions, the fellow of the Academies of Science and Engineering in India, and a World Economic Forum Technology Advisor as well. And I believe he's very proud of the recipient of the Hari Om Trust Award of the University Grants Commission, which recognizes a person for serving both science and society. The format of today's program will be a kind of a fireside chat between Vijay and Genya, with me not bothering because these are the experts that we want to hear from. And then there will be some time for questions at some intermediate periods that Siddhant will curate. And then At the end, there will be, again, some time for more questions from the audience. And finally, a summary by me at the end of the session. So over to you, Genya and Vijay, to begin the conversation. Thank you again for doing this.
Thank you, Rama, and hello, everyone. It's wonderful to see you still virtually on the screen, but good nonetheless. And Dr. Chandru, it's a pleasure to be doing this again with you. And I think as we settle in here for our fireside chat, I'd like to pose a question to you, given your breadth of experience and understanding at the intersections of bio and digital. What is really exciting you these days when it comes to the convergence of those two areas in the healthcare space? Could you just elaborate a little bit on what gets you up in the morning and keeps you going through the day and is really sparking some energy and joy in your life as you work in this space?
Yes, no, thanks, Jenny. And again, hello, everyone. And it's great to be here talking to Plaksha, again, the community. I think basically we have a very interesting sort of convergence that has happened scientifically, because in some ways, biology, particularly molecular biology, went through some rapid, progress in the particularly in the 90s and onwards. Where I think the ability to do very high throughput and high precision measurements in biology, opened up biology to, I would say, the fourth paradigm of science, which is sort of became a data-driven science. And I think it was at that point that many computer scientists, including thought leaders like Donald Knuth, essentially pointed us younger computer scientists to start looking at biology and looking at the interface between biology and computing, because he thought it was a very rich area of the intersection and interdisciplinary kind of work possible. As a consequence, there was a lot of momentum into what you might call computational biology, bioinformatics, and so on, which in many ways has been very fruitful. I mean, it was coincidental that the Human Genome Project was progressing, getting to a tipping point by the start of the new millennium, and I think the computer science methodologies were coming in and bringing sort of the state of the art of computing in, and as a consequence, today we have annotations of the human genome, which have started unraveling some of the secrets and the mysteries of life, right? So I think so that has made it an extraordinarily exciting journey for some of us who've been lucky to be at this interface. In many ways, you can think of bioinformatics as having provided the software, for what is starting to, become a real biotechnology revolution, which is probably going to dominate this century, the way it's evolving. So.
And on the Human Genome Project, since you brought that up, and that was now several decades ago, my understanding is that the compute power needed to be able to understand the information coming from the sequencing was not available, and that the Human Genome Project was really a great catalyst for the development and innovation in computational power and also in techniques. Is that fair to say? Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on that? And I know you were part of that.
Yes, I think certainly the Human Genome Project, was a great challenge. It was a great challenge, from actually a laboratory perspective, because you actually had to sequence a very long genome, 3 billion letters, and you could only sequence it, piece at a time, but then there was a computational challenge of how you could reassemble from the pieces, and I think that until you got to the first reference genome, this was really an assembly problem. And then after you got that first reference genome, your computational methods, had it a little easier, and you could just do alignments. And I think, but overall, I think computational, power that came into play. I don't know if you can really say that the Human Genome Project pushed the computing edge, because there were other factors as well. You actually had the internet; it was growing, and there was also lots of, computational science was being pushed by astronomy, was being pushed by material science. So biology played a role, but I would say that the overall, fourth paradigm of science was really what pushed it. And of course, there were also commercial drivers, and gaming, for example, had a profound influence on computing and the creation of GPUs and so on, which has led to extraordinary. The whole field of deep learning would not have happened if that whole gaming push had not actually created all that new hardware. So I think it's very interesting, sort of how these things have progressed. But certainly biology has benefited from all of these advances in computing, and vice versa. I think computing eventually will also have biological computers. So we'll have DNA computing and so on playing a role, and perhaps pushing computing forward. So I think there's a lot of richness at the interface. Yeah.
I'm going to deviate a little bit from our prepared questions here and pick up on that piece on biological computing, because I find that space to be very fascinating. Yeah. And you've already elaborated a little bit that the fourth paradigm is really that biology is data driven, and from many conversations and my understanding, DNA is treated like code. It holds data. So where do you see the ability for us to hold data in DNA going?
Well, certainly I think there's been some early attempts to think about storage, data storage, as being, being very naturally embedded in biology. And I think, we will probably see that first. I think right now there's a lot of focus on quantum computing. So, that may precede, the biological computing, but I think, and in many ways, I think the idea that you could do very complex operations using biology and control in, with some controls in, is starting to evolve. And Susan Hockfield at MIT has written this wonderful book called The Age of Living Machines. And I think, so it, I think the next phase is really how we can engineer biology, right? And that's going to be, a fascinating next phase. And where that will lead with biological computing, I'm not sure, but certainly I think one thing is very clear, that data encoding in biology can be extremely compact, and that has great potential, I think, it'll be a while before we actually see it evolve. But I think theoretically it seems like a great possibility.
All right. Thank you for that. And thanks for sparking some imagination there about the possibilities for the future. I would be remiss, however, if we don't return back to the task at hand that Rama set out for us, which is in the healthcare space. We've got to get back to that.
Yeah.
And I wanted to come back to you as you have been involved in a lot of the developments around the implementation of genomics and sequencing into healthcare, as well as other industries. And if you could think of a situation maybe in the last year that was really interesting to you, that shows the convergence of some of the digital technologies and the biotechnologies coming into play in very specific ways to be able to diagnose and to identify a treatment for a patient. Does anything come to mind?
Yeah. Yeah, actually, there are so many sort of examples that one could go with, but I think it might be interesting for the audience to actually do something more anecdotal, right? And I think maybe I will describe one particular example that brings out the power of this convergence, right? So this goes back to March of this year. The pandemic had slowed down, and in India, we were between the waves, and so I went with some friends to see wildlife at Kabini. It's the famous game reserve near Bangalore, and I got a call. While on the last day that I was there, that a colleague had fallen seriously ill and had been admitted in the ICU, and it was a very odd situation. This this colleague he was about 50. He's about 50 years old. He had a little bit of nausea and was not feeling up to the mark, but he was still working at night, and then in the morning, I think the family just let him sleep because he'd probably been up late in the night, and by about noon he was not responding. So they took him to the hospital, and it turned out that he was in septic shock, and and he was in very bad state. I think his blood pressure was dropping. He was getting into multiple organ failure, and the doctors, of course, the ICU moved into action. Just assumed that there was a very severe infection of some kind, treated him both with antibiotics and with antivirals, did everything you do to resuscitate a person in that condition, and managed to stabilize him. And now this was actually, I think, a Tuesday, and by so he was, the doctors were giving us odds of maybe 20% chance of his surviving and recovering from this, and so it was a very difficult situation for the family, and for all of us who had worked for almost 20 years with this colleague, and then the most complicated thing was we were not getting clear diagnosis of what might have set this off. How come he went into septic shock so rapidly, right? Normally, with septic shock, you would have fevers and so on, run for days, and then the infection builds up, your cytokine storm, sets in and starts affecting your organs. But but this was very rapid and it was very strange. And so we kept asking physicians, and we consulted with many physicians in this city who were leading lights and so on, but we were not getting any answers on what might have set this off, and so therefore how this should be treated, right? Of course, they did the usual, urine and blood cell cultures, and of course that took a week, before you get the results back, and didn't actually tell us very much. But even before we got back the cell cultures, the whole Strand community, who knew this colleague very well, said, let's try to do something. So after getting consent, this was maybe the third or the fourth day, we took a blood sample and also had collected some control blood samples from his wife and also a few others, and then put it into a next-gen sequencer and just sequenced all these samples, and our thought was the following, that you have cell-free DNA, which is essentially as cells die, they shed DNA into the bloodstream. And so these could be coming from normal cells and normal process of apoptosis, but it could also be coming from the viral pathogen or the bacteria. And so if we could just collect all this cell-free DNA and sequence it, maybe we would be able to find something. Now, Strand has actually been a pioneer in the country in cell-free DNA work for cancer, but we had not done it for pathogens and infectious diseases. So this was a sort of a challenge to the scientific group at Strand to address, and they had to do it at breakneck speed, right? So the sequencing was relatively straightforward. For doing the bioinformatics analysis, they had to set things up. And so over the weekend, this was on a Friday night that the work began. Over the weekend, they basically set it up. And by Monday at about 11 at night, they had the sequencing done and the analysis, the first level analysis done. And in order to look at the data, the team used a couple of off-the-shelf systems. Kraken and Centrifuge were the two, and then they were hoping that they would come up with pathogens that had caused the sepsis. And now, usually, you get tens of millions of fragments that you sequence. So this, this particular experiment generated about 50 gigabytes of data, right? There were about 42 million fragments that we found in these samples. And now we discarded the longer fragments because, those are unlikely to come from pathogens. And so we stuck to the smaller pathogens and then use these packages, Kraken and Centrifuge, to see if there were any of these pathogens there. Now, that didn't actually give us any result, which was really disappointing. And I think there was also a sense that the microbial fragments constituted only 0.005%, right? We would expect 0.05%. So it was off by a factor. And that we thought was perhaps because the sample had been collected 3 or 4 days after treatment had begun. So maybe there was less traces of the pathogens. But so it was, a situation where we were willing to throw in the towel, and then the bioinformaticians and the computer scientists in the company said, no, the problem is we are using a package that we don't know what is in the package. These off-the-shelf packages. So let's do it over again and do it ourselves. So Strand has built its own NGS software, so it really understands how NGS analysis is to be done.
Mhm.
And we also decided to reassemble the genomes of the pathogens, about 304 well-known pathogens that cause sepsis. And so this was done. And by Wednesday night, we were ready to rerun the analysis with all this reworking of the data and informatics. And when we reran it, we found 4 fragments, right? And it was very clear, it was very distinct. It was from the patient, and it was not present in the other samples. And these 4 fragments gave us a signal of something called Salmonella typherium. It's a non typhoid causing variant of Salmonella, and it normally comes with food poisoning, and normally a healthy person is able to get over it pretty quickly. So your own immune system should be able to knock it off. You'd have some nausea and so on, but usually it would clear. But in this case, we also found out that this colleague had purchased some frozen meat dishes and had consumed them on that Monday, which just before the incident set off. So that was a nice confirmation that perhaps this came through consuming. And the reason he went into septic shock so quickly was probably because of the inoculum, because he probably ingested a lot of the typherium. And so now the good news was that they were targeted antibiotics, like that could be given to him. And in fact, one of the antibiotics that they had given him in the sort of broad spectrum treatment when he first came to the ICU was a targeted therapy that would have worked, but they didn't know. So they they moved on from that antibiotic. So we got him back onto that, and he recovered. And the poor chap had to also continue some dialysis because of the damage, but and because while getting the dialysis done, he got COVID.
Oh my
So
gosh. Okay.
it just but fortunately, all of those things were solved, and he's back at work, and
Yeah.
still, and he's an. The amazing thing is that he can look back and say that the software that he wrote has somehow been that he has pulled him back from the brink, right? Because
Yeah.
I think it was
So,
really
Dr. Chandru, we have a question that came in that actually makes me want to ask you in response to this story. Not everybody can have access to the highest level experts at Strand to help them
right.
sort out why they've ended up in the hospital and what's the right treatment. So,
Right.
I know
Yeah.
you have.
So let
How
me.
do we how do
Yeah.
we see the adoption of digital
Right.
technologies
Exactly.
actually enabling access and affordable
Right.
treatments here?
So we are actually, trying to see whether this can be developed into a regular service, right, for ICUs. And at this point, it looks like this can be actually packaged into, a price point which seems high, but could still be it could make sense. I think around 20,000 rupees, you should be able to provide this as a diagnostic service. Now it's a lot more expensive than doing cell cultures, but it's now remember, one extra night in the ICU is typically a lakh of rupees. So 20,000 seems like a reasonable amount to pay for getting to a quick diagnosis. Now, what took us about 5 days to solve, I think now can be compressed into 24 hours to 36 hours. I'm just going to take a parallel to this to explain how this can happen. In the US, in neonatal ICUs, there's a group at Radies in San Diego that developed a similar methodology where they could do whole genome sequencing of infants who were in distress.
In the NICU.
Right?
Yep.
And then they have now compressed the service to under 24 hours. They can even do it in about 16 hours, right? So you do the sequencing. Of course, they have the power of Illumina right there. So Illumina can do the sequencing for them, and then they can run the analysis and give the results to the NICU, the neonatal ICU physicians to go forward with treatment. And this has been done so successfully now for the last couple of years that the Kingsmore was the geneticist who drove that. And now it's being adopted at neonatal ICUs all across the US, right? And it's actually become a solution that is carried out. So,
yeah, and I understand they actually got that paid for by insurance companies based on the data.
Right, yeah. So
in
they
terms of how
did,
much time they were saving.
Exactly.
By figuring out what was wrong with these babies really quickly. It was worth the cost of the sequencing.
Yeah, so I heard Kingsmore give the economic analysis as well. So after around the first 20 cases that they'd done, they could actually show that there was a great saving involved. And I think after that, insurance companies started picking it up. So I think this is, it's very doable. I think it's, and it's always the first time around is the innovative step, but then it can be productized and taken forward.
Okay.
So,
all right. Well, while we wait for some questions to come in, I wanted to maybe move on a little bit and get into some of the global issues.
Yeah. No. So I think it's would like to ask you what I as I said. I gave an example from the U.S. as well that that is at this cutting edge of the convergence. But what do you see at a global level, Genya? Are these convergences actually leading to precision medicine, or and wider adoption, or is it hype, or because I think from your vantage point at the World Economic Forum, you probably see what's happening around the world.
Yeah, I know that there is a lot of interest, a lot of promise, and a lot of hype when it comes to understanding, for example, the applications of machine learning and AI in the health and healthcare space, and also in the ability for us to be able to sequence and understand at the very basic level, what a person's genomic makeup, and combine that with an understanding of where they live, how they work, what their life is like, and be able to tailor treatments in those directions. But I also know that there's an abundance of caution, I think, as well in the space. We have seen, for example, in 2011, the situation with IBM, where they turned their Watson supercomputers to healthcare. And there was a lot of hype and a lot of money flowing in to say that applying machine learning algorithms onto various data sets would be able to help doctors more quickly identify the right treatment for cancer. So IBM spent a lot of time with a couple of big hospitals trying to hoover in lots and lots of different sources of information and test whether their algorithms were able to generate diagnoses or directions more quickly than doctors could. And it didn't actually work out. And I think now in 2021, a decade later, the balloon has been punctured a little bit in terms of the excitement around some of the AI applications on big sets of health related data and really complicated health problems. I think we are seeing more pragmatic approaches, I think, where AI and machine learning is coming in to help with diagnoses more on the imaging side. So a lot of the radiology questions, and this is a space where I think they've kind of slowed down a little bit and said, all right, how do we work better with doctors to understand where the intersections of AI and machine learning can be really useful in health and healthcare, and maybe brought the hype down a little bit based on some of the lessons learned with the exuberance over AI with Watson. So we know that there's a lot happening in the AI and health convergence space around drug discovery, about trying to leverage these huge data sets to be able to do predictive analytics, and then also just, I think, routine situations where they're just trying to straighten out and streamline billing processes, for example. So I would say, yep, it's happening there, and the application spaces are, I think, very optimistic on a global level. On the genomic side, things get a little bit more hairy, and that is where we've seen genetic testing and prenatal screening kind of jump into the headlines recently with the understanding that the Beijing Genome Institute in China, which has admittedly probably the world's largest repository of genomic information on humans and other organisms, there were reports that some of their prenatal testing kits were generating data that was informing some studies by the Chinese military. And so people got really nervous about that. But genetic testing, genetic screening, and again, as you brought up, the sequencing example from the NICUs, it's moving into the space, particularly as the cost of sequencing comes down and data analytics get better. So I think we're moving there at the global level.
What sort of policy and societal issues do you see as challenges that could be perhaps holding back the progress with precision medicine? I think we all thought, with President Obama's initiative, which now is called All of Us, that we will be seeing this rollout a lot faster. But there are obviously some challenges.
Yeah, I think if we go back to that example that just recently was in the news around where do the genomic data that are coming from some of these screening kits go, that has always been a big question on the mind of policymakers, and has been, I would say, a forcing factor in some of the policy changes that we've seen around the protection of data, especially very sensitive categories of data like health data and then genomic data. So I understand anyway from talking with colleagues that when the situation emerged with the genetic testing kits that was looking for genes linked to Down syndrome and a number of other conditions, I think over 8 million women in the world had taken these tests developed by the Beijing Genome Institute, that regulators started to ask some questions about the data and where those data are going, where are they stored, how are they disposed of, and what are the protections around them. That is one of the bigger challenges, I would say, when it comes to the operationalizing of precision medicine. In some situations where you are taking that kind of genomic information, that could be used to identify people or families, and also pinpoint certain characteristics that might lead them to be discriminated against. Those data questions really sort of underpin and cause pause when it comes to some of these precision medicine and health applications. So I know that that's probably one of the bigger policy questions out there, is how to handle this data. So and Dr. Chandru, do we have time to take some questions? Can we put a pause in here? I see a couple hands here, and maybe there will be more. Do you mind?
No, I think that's perfect. Yeah, let's open it up for some.
All right. I see a couple hands. Sadan, will you help us here?
So Mitali, if you'd like to go first, please, with your question.
Yeah. Thank you, Siddhant, and excellent insights shared by both of you, Dr. Genya and Professor Chandru. So my question would be, maybe I'll break it up in two. So I also feel that sequences as diagnostic kind of tool is an excellent thought that should be taken forward. But the challenge will be, how do you bring down the cost and create accessibility? So in the similar context, I think this was responded to. In a similar context, I also heard from Professor Chandru about cancer as a biomarker. You did look at the cell-free DNA approach. So just wondering, how was your experience with that, and how do you see that growing? Because indeed, cancer still remains a huge challenge with all of us, and especially in our country, in terms of early diagnosis and more precision treatment for cancer. So that is the first part. And the second is that excitement all of us have working or looking into this area on the launch of the digital health ID in our country, which will integrate the electronic health records with the ID. So how do you see this development taking us forward in realizing some of the potentials of digital health, which can change the healthcare system in our country?
Yeah. So I'm going to go in reverse order. I'm going to go in reverse order. Sorry about that. I think on the digital National Digital Health Mission, and the Prime Minister's announcements yesterday, I think, and this connects with also a little bit with what Genya was talking about. I think, so the whole issue of privacy of data, health data, and so on. So, I mean, I think, obviously, India's had tremendous success with population scale, information technology. I mean, the fact that something like the Aadhaar project could be pulled off with the national unique ID at the scale of 1.2, 1.3 billion, I think has given the leadership a lot of confidence now that something can be done also in healthcare that could be give us a sort of a leapfrog opportunity, right? At the same time, I think in some sense we have to build things from scratch, right? The electronic health records and digital lockers, so that there is some control. The legal positions are very clear that this data really belongs to the individual, to the patient, to the citizen, and therefore, the framework that is being developed under the Ayushman Bharat scheme and the National Digital Health Mission is sort of paying attention to that. I think it will. It's it's still in early stages. I mean, we're starting to see, the health ID being rolled out at the level of those who are benefiting from the public insurance schemes. I think for other citizens, it's really going to be a voluntary, step to get one of these unique health IDs. I think the development of and the standardization of the personal health records, the digital lockers. There's a very large development effort going on, and a large number of volunteers involved, just like with the Aadhaar project. In fact, there's a lot strong overlap. The iSpirit groups and so on, which are involved in the development. So I think there is, and we have some challenges yet. I think the formal data protection bill hasn't come through Parliament yet, and the whole treatment of non-personal data is there's a governance report that the Chris Gopalakrishnan committee has put together, but it's these are all still guidelines. They haven't actually been formalized. So there are some challenges, and I think if you don't address them well, we will get slowed down. But otherwise, technologically, I think we're in a position where this can be rolled out, very effectively in the next few years. I mean, it's not going to happen overnight, but it's going to, it's within reach. I think is what I would like to convey. I think on the cancer early detection, in some sense, it's the holy grail, right?
Yeah.
And of course, there's a company called Grail, which is actually making this a reality. I mean, if you actually see what Grail has accomplished today, it can detect about 50 different types of cancer, and but there's still some big regulatory hoops to go through. Strand itself has worked with blood, saliva, cerebral fluids, urine, and we've been able to get to, I would say, about 70% accuracy. But I think and obviously that gets higher specificity as you as you go into later stages of cancer. So in the early stages, it's, the signal to noise ratios are a challenge, and so you need both very sophisticated laboratory methods and informatics to train. So it's another convergence area, and but I think it's fairly routine now for, say, lung cancer, particularly to look at the mutations. If you're looking for a specific mutation, makes it a lot easier and affordable. If you are actually going to try to sequence from cfDNA, like we did for the sepsis case, to also look for cancer, I think that the price points are still a little high for something like that. So, but it is the future. I'm pretty convinced that within the next 5 years, we will see an ability to detect cancer reasonably early, and it will become a manageable disease. And I think in that sense, we will hopefully have much higher rates of survival, right? There's I think survival, in the formal sense of survival, that is 5 years good quality life after diagnosis. So I think that that's very achievable. And that's going to be, in fact, one of the greatest contributions of new age genomics.
Professor Chandru, we also have a couple of other questions if you could take them, and I'll maybe request the audience members to ask both questions together so that perhaps we can address them. So Yash, if you'd like to go first, and then Lakshmi, if you'd like to go next, please unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, everyone. So good evening to Vijay Chandru sir and Genya Dana. I'm Yash Sabu from the alma mater of Mr. Vijay Chandru Bitspilani. So my question basically is, keeping India in the limelight, what are the common questions and the responses you receive in matters of ethics behind the precision medicine and the new era of diagnostics technology that you're talking about, and also also keeping in mind there are big taboos related to incorporating this technology in India, like in the Indian communities. So was my question audible?
Yeah, I think we got it.
I think so.
So Genya, you want to?
Yeah, no, let's let Lakshmi go first, and then we'll see if they line up.
Sure.
Hello, good evening, Dr. Genya and Professor Chandru. So I was working with GE as an ultrasound application specialist. So I was more interested in the application of AI into image processing. So my question here is that what is the kind of progression of digital technology that you see in radiology in the upcoming years? Because we are aware of robotic surgeries and bionic eyes and stuff like that. So I just wanted to understand what is the next step that AI will bring in terms of in the field of radiology.
Okay. Dr. Chandru, on the radiology one, I'm going to say that my understanding is not very deep, but my understanding is that this is probably one of the more practical spaces that we see, and also a way where machine learning and AI is being able to demonstrate its ability to help with shortages in workforces, and also the ability to streamline diagnostic times and be able to help with patient populations that may not be able to get access to a sophisticated health center. So from my understanding and read of the landscape, this is one of those bright spots, really, I think, in practical applications of AI and machine learning in the healthcare space. What would be your opinion on that? And then we'll go back to these ethical questions.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I think it's already been in play for some time now, both in radiology and now increasingly in pathology as well. And now a fully automated call out is probably not quite there yet, but it's for certain features it can it's very high reliability. So finally the pathologist or the radiologist who signs off pretty much doesn't have to make too many changes. Right? There may be occasional examples for which they have to spend more time on it, but otherwise it comes through pretty fast. So for example, in digital pathology at Strand, we were in a position where we were doing about 300 samples a day on an automated platform, and were able to generate reports. So this was for the HCG corporate hospital group. So they were seeing a lot of cancer patients, and pathology is basic there. So so I agree with you. I think just a small caveat is that certain types of radiology, for example, chest X-rays and so on, we still don't have a good benchmark set for that is for India, right? There are lots of very good international benchmark databases, but we don't have a well-curated, annotated database for India. And that's been one of the challenges during this whole COVID thing, that we've not been able to build a really reliable AI engine for diagnosing, right? The problem is, sorry to say, but we have dirty lungs, right? Because of the levels of pollution in our cities and so on. And so the AI engine that might have been built on clean lungs, just has a rough time when it looks at images from Indian patients. So this is something that people deep in this area are aware of, but yet there hasn't been a solution in sight, of actually creating. So it's a great opportunity for whoever wants to do it. To create probably a good set, will take about 10 to 20 crores of investment, a good database. And that's not a lot of money, really, when you think about the impact it can have. So I hope somebody in the audience, takes it up as a challenge. Right?
Thank you, Dr. Chandru, and maybe I'll turn and make some remarks about the question around ethics, and then I have a question for you that may segue right into Yash's question. So I'm really glad that the question was raised around the ethics around using genomic information for diagnostics in particular. And I would welcome Yash to come back or drop any clarifying questions in the chat. But my understanding was that the ability to diagnose and to have that kind of information raises some ethical questions. And we have grappled with those within our community at the World Economic Forum and globally, particularly when we receive requests and start working with countries who see the promise of being able to do genetic testing to more quickly pinpoint, say, for instance, populations or persons who show up who may have a mutation like a BRCA mutation for breast cancer. So we did this work where a country we were working with in Africa wanted to implement BRCA testing. The conundrum that we ran into, aside from all the consent and data collection questions, was, okay, so if you are able to diagnose, then where is the treatment? And if you are not able to provide access to the appropriate treatment for whatever disease it is that you may have just diagnosed, what do you do then? And so it becomes sort of a whole of healthcare or whole of government question at that point. If you are going to implement something like genetic testing or screening, what do you then do with that information? Have you equipped yourself financially and materially to be able to provide the appropriate treatment options? Because that information can be very distressing to learn. And then if it is not actionable, what is the obligation then of the healthcare system and the provider to even know that information? So that was a big challenge with us, was to be able to marry up the treatment part of it. Another huge question, which again we alluded to, I think, with the recent news on genetic testing and where the data go and how you're looking at different populations, are the discrimination questions. So this has been a big issue, and from the beginning, really, I think, of us understanding that we could probably pinpoint groups of individuals or specific populations, and that we should not be able to discriminate against those groups based on something that you find in their genomic information. And we passed a law in the United States that said that health insurers could not discriminate based on that, knowing that information. There's some gaps in there when it comes to things like life insurance. But we are aware that not all countries have these genetic information non-discrimination acts. And so knowing that information, even inadvertently, about yourself or about someone can lead to situations where we understand bad behavior could happen. So I wanted to just share those perspectives on the ethics piece. And then, Dr. Chandru, I know that India is embarking upon their own genome project. And, would you like to kind of tie in those questions with your
Yes.
understanding of the goals of that project, and are the ethical considerations around sequencing of populations included in that work?
All right. So first, let me thank you. I think that's a nice segue into the on the ethics and the particular problem of genomic information and discrimination. India is unfortunately one of those countries that does not have a Genomic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And in fact, if you look at our insurance regulatory guidelines, the IRDA guidelines, there is a specific mention of, that allows payers to deny coverage for pre-existing conditions, which includes genetic. So there's actually a license almost to payers to deny coverage. This was noted in a landmark judgment in the Delhi High Court about 2 years ago, and the IRDA was hauled up by the authority, the Insurance Regulatory Authority was hauled up by the judge. And her name is Justice Pratibha Singh, and she's been extraordinarily well informed about genetic issues and so on. And unfortunately, I think that reform in the IRDA or the just movement towards a Genomic Information Non-Discrimination Act in Parliament has not happened. So that would be a wonderful, again, project to work on to correct this huge inequity in our laws. That said, I think there's certainly a lot of push towards building capacity to do genomics in the country. The India Genome Projects, and the idea that there would be kind of a national mission now that would push understanding our diversity and genomics better. Certainly, from a research point of view, there's a lot of excitement, and I think there's a lot of capacity building. Some of our big institutions that, some institutions that are really well equipped now are places like IGIB in Delhi, the CCMB, the Center for Cellular Molecular Biology at Hyderabad. And so these are all CSIR institutions, and then you have places like Indian Institute of Science and so on. So there are a bunch of NovaSeqs, which are very high throughput sequencing platforms spread around the country. Some of the medical institutions like AIIMS in Delhi, of course, also have these platforms. There's widespread, deployment of sequencing technologies, so I think there's going to be a lot of momentum in research projects. I think where how this enters into sort of clinical use will depend on how well our physicians, take it up. The challenge that we faced as a company providing genomic diagnostics has been that there's a again the question you raised, Genya, that if it's not clear how this affects treatment and how you would modulate treatment, for example, with BRCA, the breast cancer mutations, if there's a patient who's already diagnosed with breast or ovarian cancer and they have the BRCA mutations, actually treatment can change. You would actually introduce things like PARP inhibitors and so on. And so there are now evolving protocols for that, but it's not well understood by the entire physician community, and so it isn't taken forward. But it's also true that in many cases, what you can do with genomics is solve the diagnostic odyssey, right? So there's value in that. Obviously, there are many situations where people have an ailment or obviously have symptoms of something serious, but they really don't know what is causing it, and then you're able to identify what exactly might have caused it through the genomic analysis.
So, Dr. Chandru, I know we have a couple more hands here. I mean that your I'm sure there's going to come up some more questions maybe about workforce and education and those kinds of things.
Sure,
but maybe I can intervene here and then see, Siddhant, if you want to take it 2 by 2 or how you want to do this, because I see 4 hands up.
Yes. So I request Akash to go ahead, and maybe along with Akash, if I could request Anisha to share her question right after, so then we can have 2 and 2. Akash, if you're there, please feel free to go ahead and ask your question. Anisha, if you'd like to go in the meantime.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Siddhant. Also, thank you, Dr. Genya and Dr. Chandru, for taking the time and speaking with us. I had a quick question about the fact that, the community health centers and the primary health centers in rural India, like they struggle with basic infrastructure in terms of like 24/7 electricity or skilled manpower, right? Like, and that is actually needed if there is a comparable quality of life experience if you were in a city, so they are not able to deliver that. Like, if you're comparing like the rural and urban settings, what are some of the steps that businesses and policymakers need to take to, innovatively bridge that gap? Because we know that these are some problem areas that our country faces. And obviously you want to make sure that everyone has access to good quality of life treatment or, interventions when needed if they are sick. So, yeah.
Thanks, Anisha. Akash, if you'd like to go ahead now.
Hi, thank you, Siddhant. So I have a related question. So I had some personal experience during the COVID where there were some situations in the rural. I was in a rural area, so I had a personal experience where there was some medical emergency. So my question to the panel is, how can we bridge the gap between the quality of care that we deliver to the rural areas and the quality of healthcare that we deliver to the urban areas? Taking apart the telemedicine part, what are the other areas that we can use digital technologies to bridge the quality of care at the rural area sector?
Okay. Siddhant, sounds like good questions. I want to just maybe someone, the other 2 could wave if they have similar ones. I'm not sure.
So Rishi, I think he has a slightly different one. So Rishi, if you'd like to go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair, and good morning to Dr. Rana and good evening, sir, to Dr. Chandru. The question is, you talk about machine learning and AI and genetics. How do you apply both of these to psychiatry and mental health issues? And
Oh.
Do not think, how would it, for example, address cases like autism, which are essentially genetic? But if you do have a profile both of genetics and machine and through AI of psychiatric patients, couldn't this increase discrimination, which psychiatric patients of all hues already face? Thank you.
Oh, okay, that's a tough one.
So we have one more question from Simran. Should she also share it right now? And then
Yeah, let's go ahead, and then we'll close that down in terms of
so
questions.
I have two questions. So one was related to what everyone was asking, how the workforce could be managed in a way that this information is more useful and more beneficial in terms of treatment. And other, if you could suggest some readings related to how precision healthcare has evolved over years and how like we can learn from history over that. So maybe that would be helpful for us.
Okay, I know the readings question could be addressed by collecting a few of Dr. Chandru's favorite books. Maybe we can do that one offline and get those back to you. The other two, Dr. Chandru, do you want to take the sort of India healthcare setup and gaps in care and access?
Right. Very important question, and it's, as was mentioned in the introduction, I am a technology sort of co-chair for the Lancet Commission, in which we are actually looking at what it would take to get to universal healthcare by 2030. That's in fact the vision that we're working towards. Now, obviously, most of our discussion today around precision medicine, genomics, and so on, doesn't quite address that challenge. So legitimate that you raised the question of how does technology help address primary healthcare and universal healthcare and so forth. And I think there are again, how can technology help elevate healthcare in the country is really the question. And there's obviously a number of things that can happen, but one thing to really leverage here is the fact that we do have an fairly strong communications infrastructure in this country, right? The ability to reach with mobile is pretty impressive. How do we leverage that? Now, obviously, we can reach people, through the mobile technology in a digital sense, but then in actual care, how do we provide care? And I think the answers are probably that we'll have to actually strengthen the whole primary care infrastructure of the country. I mean, if you actually go back to the Alma Ata Declaration of WHO back in 1978, the whole perspective was we should get to universal healthcare primarily, by focusing on primary healthcare, right? And we've been remiss. We've not actually done that. I think there is definitely a recognition that that's where there has to be focus. There also has to be better financial outlays towards public health to make that a reality. I think we are spending about 2 trillion rupees in our healthcare budget, out of which also there was all the costs of vaccination and so on. So we're still under 1% really of GDP allocated to public healthcare. If you actually look at the out-of-pocket expenditure, then it comes up to 4% or so. But really, our public health outlays our public, the budget allocations for public health has to increase if you really want to elevate the system. Technology can play a role, and I think what would be very exciting is, of course, to be able to equip A&Ms and ASHA workers and so on, at in the remote locations, train them to be able to use, point of care devices for diagnosis, and help, and also to help with telemedicine, where the A&M or the ASHA worker actually helps to make the conversation between a physician, maybe located in an urban setting, with the patients. And I think the e-Sanjeevani portal recorded something like 1.25 billion interactions, right, during this COVID period. So I think that Prime Minister has actually used that number yesterday in the announcement. But and that is just the government-driven telemedicine portals. I mean, there's a very good move to actually standardize telemedicine now through something called the Swasth Alliance and Swasth Health Foundation, and it's a consortium approach which will hopefully lead to better quality standards for telemedicine. So I think it's various combination of methodologies. I do think AI can play a role there, obviously, and mobile technologies and point of care, diagnosis, and e-farmers. There's also now the ability to deliver medicines, through the logistics frameworks and courier services and so on. And because you have, ability to do through the internet, it's still a very small fraction of the overall pharmaceuticals business, but it'll gain momentum, I believe. And I think there's if we think out a little bit further, and maybe out 10 years to there may be several other technologies that we'd be able to leverage, right? Certainly, things like drones and so on, which would seem a little far-fetched today, could play a very significant role in connecting the unconnected, right? And I think we're running a Moonshots theme workshop on Saturday, on Gandhi Jayanti Day, to actually talk about some of this, how autonomous vehicles and drone technologies and so on can play a role in healthcare in years to come. But that's so I think there's no easy answers, I think, for something as big as universal healthcare. But I think genomics and so on will play a role in we'll probably have CRISPR-based point of care diagnostics, for example, that would be for detection of various mutations and biomarkers which can help, and that. So we didn't get into gene editing and so on in our discussion today.
We didn't yet, Dr. Chandru, but I do recognize too that we have this question about mental health and mental disorders and the intersection around AI, machine learning, and some of the genomic understanding of some of the mental health conditions. And this is a I would say, a very exciting but young space in terms of understanding the genomics around different mental health disorders. And I have often been very, very cautious in this space around where there's a lot of research happening. And we know that the treatments that are in commonplace now are, it's a lot of trial and error, and we have high hopes for the ability to use genetic markers to be able to say, you have treatment-resistant depression early on, and so let us skip the diagnostic odyssey, as you put it, with all of these other drugs, and go to something that is more tailored for the condition if we could know that up front. But my understanding is that the science is young there. And I understand also that when it comes to the intersection around genomic data and the ability to understand markers or correlations between specific markers and conditions, that is also a very exciting but young space. And so bringing machine learning into looking at those kinds of data sets and trying to draw inferences and conclusions it's very promising. I know a lot of investments are going into that space. But there's a lot of care that must be taken as well. There's a question also in my chat about using AI technologies on COVID-19 patients. And I know that there's been work to look into the genomic underpinnings and try to make correlations between some genetic markers and the severity of COVID. But I just in general in this space of wading through all of the data and understanding and making inferences on the basis of genomic information, we still have a long way to go, and we need to be really careful. That's also why I think in some situations we have payers or insurers really refusing to cover some of these particular tests because they're not sure that the evidence is really there, that if you get a test and there's a signal, that you always can go straight to an appropriate treatment. So take your views on that. I think we have about 3 more minutes to get through that, and then I'll turn it over to Rama. What is your views? Is what I'm saying making sense?
Oh no, yeah, absolutely. I think, but there are some very exciting sort of experiments going on. I think you're right. That, and it's still early stages. But I was talking to probably one of the leading psychiatrists in the country who also is well versed in genomics, and this is Dr. Sanjeev Jain at Nimhans, and just a couple of days back, and we've been looking at some genomic markers and so on of some of the patients he deals with, and but what is very exciting is some work that they've been doing with a fairly large cohort now, where they're essentially patients with mental health issues, where they've used induced pluripotent stem cell technology to actually induce neurons from blood samples of these patients, and can use the neurons as as a model system. And they've also done a whole exome sequencing of these patients. So they've actually built now an interesting platform for exploration. So, but these are research projects. I don't think these are necessarily already having clinical outcomes. I think on AI and things like autism and so on, there's lots of exploration going on, not that you wouldn't really call clinical in the pharmaceutical sense, but they are more things like using robots, using learning methodologies for using computing and so on in many ways to help children with in the spectrum with
Right.
learning concepts and getting value out of these.
Okay.
So I think those are just the comments I would like to add. I think maybe we're just about at
Yeah.
closing out time. So
Yeah.
we'll stop
Thank
there.
you, Dr. Chandru. Over to you, Rama.
Yeah, hey, thank you so much for those fantastic insights. Vijay, you come from both the academia and an entrepreneur, being founding Strand Life Sciences, and you talked a lot about your experiences there. And going forward, I know that it's going to achieve much more things, Strand, and growing bigger and better. And Genya, from your perch at the World Economic Forum, I think you get a whole world view, and also see some of the the challenges that are there in inequity across the world and even within countries. So I'm glad you pointed that out, and some of the questions also came up on those areas. And to the audience, I'm particularly delighted that all of you joined us in this part of the Tech Thought series that we at Plaksha are organizing, co-organizing, co-delivering, designing with the Carnegie Institution Endowment for International Peace, the India chapter. And this is the fourth of the series, and there is two more that we are going to be doing, one on humans and robots coming up on October 12th. So please look at that coming up. And some of the things, of course, were already summarized, but I just thought maybe a couple of things that kind of jumped into my mind was, how this kind of convergence and of this, and also of these exponential technologies that are going on in both in life science, computer science, engineering, biology. Some of these were mentioned. How this kind of really leading to the 21st century as perhaps the century of bioengineering or engineering biology, data-driven approaches to human health, and more broadly even planetary health that we didn't talk about today. But there's a lot of intersections between human and planetary health, as we even from COVID we know that as an example. And the other, I would say, the takeaway that Genya particularly stressed on is this kind of a need for upstream thinking about policy, ethics, etc. When developing and deploying technologies, I think, and various tools. And I think that's very important. And that I think some of the education institutions would have to really take up as the challenge. And at Plaksha, we certainly see it as a great opportunity in educating the next generation of computer scientists and engineers with this perspective in mind as well. So, thank you again for sharing this. And I know that it has been early for some of you in in the West to attend this, but it certainly is a great opportunity to bring experts like this and the same platform. And I guess we'll see more of these in the future in educating and inspiring our audiences both in India and around the world. Thank you again, Vijay and Genya, for doing this. Really deeply appreciate your time and
Thank you.
effort.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Bye.
Genya, for keeping me to the clock, because as a professor, I can always keep talking. So
No problem. It's good to see you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Yeah, thanks. Bye, Rama.